Okay, so thanks everyone for being here and welcome to the second seminar in the Disaffection seminar series hosted by the Enlightenment, Romanticism and Contemporary Culture Research Unit at the University of Melbourne. First thing I wanted to do was to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation on whose land we meet today and where we'll meet over the course of this seminar series. I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present, acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that the struggle for justice continues. So we have two main speakers today, and Justin Clemens will be their discussant. So to introduce, we have Nadia Ali, who's Associate Professor and Director of the Civilization Studies Program at the American University of Beirut. And Samo Tomšič is a Research Assistant at the Humboldt University in Berlin and Visiting Professor at the University of Fine Arts in Hamburg. Justin Clemens is Associate Professor in Literary Studies at the University of Melbourne. And the reason I inserted this particular installment into the seminar series is partly because there's a common misnomer in affect and emotion studies, such as it exists, that psychoanalysis has a deficient or entirely absent or perhaps even lacking theory of affect. And in particular, it is suggested that Lacan and his school, with their focus on signifiers, have nothing to tell us about emotion and affect. This perhaps stems from a too literal search, as if sweeping a PDF with the search function for specific mentions of affects and emotions. In fact, we might say that psychoanalysis, particularly as it pertains to clinical practice, is nothing but an encounter with affects and their effects. For the moment, we can leave questions of this misreading and its possible motivations to one side, and we can instead begin our seminar today with observation, as Bruce Fink puts it in the introduction to his translation of Colette Solaire's book, Lacanian Affects, that there is an original and unique theory of affects elaborated over decades, for example, in Lacan's seminars. So I invited two eminent, prominent, intelligent speakers in that field today to talk about this particular topic and to talk about it in a more social and political sense than that clinical sense. So I'll hand it over to Samo and Nadia. I'm not sure who's going to speak first or if you're speaking sort of tag team style, but yeah, over to you.
Yeah, Samo, I think we've agreed to I'll say a few things first and then Samo will jump in, right? So,
great.
Okay, so I'll start. So thanks a lot for this invitation. It's really great it would be nice if we were actually together, but it's really great to be part of this conversation. And so in my part of the intervention, what I want to focus on is affect, particularly the affect of anxiety, and its relationship to desire in psychoanalysis. So the main aim for me in my part of this kind of discussion is to somewhat defend the importance of anxiety as that which is constitutive of subjectivity and thereby fundamental for any consideration of politics. And of course, one can only do this while considering in the background the diagnosis of our contemporary moment, the one particularly given by Fred Jameson in Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, where he characterizes this kind of postmodern moment as being characterized by a waning of emotion. And just as a note here, Jameson in a later interview corrected his use of the word affect in the earlier text with the word emotion. And he insists upon this, the idea that it is emotion which wanes in the postmodern, and it is affect that somehow comes to take its place, and affect remains to be understood, right? It remains to be interpreted, and there are lots of stakes in doing that. There are different ways to do that. But however, for Jameson, the cognitive dissonance that characterizes this postmodern neoliberal landscape or what we could call our societies of enjoyment, is accompanied by this waning of emotion. And here, when I guess in this sense, when one says emotion, we can imagine kind of Proustian emotions. They have historical depth, kind of an experience of living in time, as Jean Genet describes Proust's narrative, so on and so forth. There's this kind of depth, living in time. And so there's a waning of these emotions, and there's an increase in affects, which, unlike emotions, resist naming, are located in the body, but again, are not simply properties of bodies, right? They lack the sense of intimacy in a certain way that emotions would entail, so on and so forth. So, I mean, given this in the background, right, it's kind of an open question, right? How does psychoanalysis sit, or what can psychoanalysis say with regards to the question of affect, and in particular, the kind of the affective anxiety? I mean, I guess we all know here that Freud was concerned with the problem of affect and anxiety from his earliest works to his late metapsychological essays. And he moves in various ways from considering anxiety as linked to the loss entailed in basically being born into the world, to castration, the loss of the mother, the loss of the love object. And finally, in his later essay on anxiety, inhibitions and symptoms, he claims that anxiety is linked to the drive. It is a cause of repression rather than the result of repression. Another fundamental figure here, and these are kind of background figures in a sense, Freud and Kierkegaard, in relationship to what Lacan will do with his engagement with affect and with anxiety in particular. So Kierkegaard, before Freud, claimed for anxiety the status of a concept, a concept for which all of existence is but an experience for Kierkegaard. So the problem for him was how to act, how to proceed when existence is always already invested, commanded, and conceptual. And this was kind of Kierkegaard's crucial problem, how to proceed, how to act when the law is always already given. So in this context, anxiety for Kierkegaard was understood in a certain way as sin, as the law, right, which both binds and loosens. Already the point of beginning, a will to power perhaps, or ressentiment, open question, which always already invests existence in a particular way. So Lacan appreciated Kierkegaard's move with regards to anxiety as well as Freud's, right? It's always already there from the beginning. However, Lacan insisted that anxiety is not a concept, but rather it is in the way of the concept, or maybe the remainder of the concept. So here, it's kind of, again, an open question, depending on how you wish to read Lacan with Hegel, right? Anxiety is an affect that comes in the place of the concept. This is, one can say this after kind of looking at Lacan's seminar on anxiety closely. And in this sense that Lacan adds to this, anxiety is not just at the beginning, always already there, constitutive simply of subjectivity, but also a remainder, has this kind of function of a remainder to the concept, or perhaps arises in the place of the concept. Of course, the concept of objet A, right, his only concept. So, and it's important here to point out that for Lacan, anxiety in the analytic setting, right, is not so much as experienced. It's not an experience, but he uses it, or kind of theorizes it, as a logical operator, right? Anxiety is this kind of moderator that has to be managed in the analytic setting, right? In order to lead to objet A, the concept that is in waiting, or anxiety is always being the remainder of the concept that is to be kind of arrived at. So the affect of anxiety in this sense for Lacan is in particular is not linked to a signifier, but to this remainder, this function of remainder, to the concept of objet A, which in itself, as we know, is not a signifier. And this is, important because, and Lacan, in his seminar on anxiety is kind of incredulous in a certain way about our modern inability to shake off anxiety in modernity. And he gives this kind of depiction of this kind of our experience in the world as being kind of on a stage, right? There's a kind of unveiling of the cosmos in a particular way with the modern moment, and anxiety seems to be preserved, right? He says this: why do we preserve the dimension of anxiety in a certain sense after the great chain of being has been dismantled? Why is there so much stage fright in modernity? So after the curtain has been lifted, after the unveiling of the laws of the cosmos has happened, why couldn't we simply get rid of this illusion of the big other, even after the unraveling of the logics of unstable structures at work in the world? So you have with Lacan's kind of seminar, this kind of very kind of move from, you know, seminar on anxiety, from unveiling to stage fright to anxiety, to the working through of anxiety, the analysis of anxiety. And of course, you know, what comes to mind here as one cannot but mention that Lacan really picks on, you know, this moment in Hamlet, right? The mousetrap Hamlet, in Hamlet, the staging, the kind of the stage within the stage, right? Or within the theater, within the drama, right? Where Hamlet stages the killing of his father. And the extreme anxiety that Hamlet faces when watching the kind of the scene of the crime, right? And Lacan introduces a very interesting, you know, reading here. He says this anxiety can be understood because if we take note that the actor who was meant to be playing, you know, Luciano, the killer of the king, was actually wearing Hamlet's own garbs, right? That he was actually somewhat Hamlet's double. Hamlet seeing himself on the stage in this context is what creates this kind of sense of anxiety. And this is what requires, in a certain way, working through Hamlet's anxiety, the inability to act, anxiety in the way of Hamlet's, you know, desire in a certain way. So there's, you know, this is kind of Lacan's kind of engagement with anxiety. It's a very strange, you know, for those of you who know it, it's a very kind of strange seminar, but fundamental seminar, because what he comes to add to this previous engagement with anxiety is this idea that there's anxiety is this remainder, is in the way of the concept. It occurs or emerges as an affect once there's an object that comes to fill a certain gap that is necessary in the symbolic for there to be a dialectic of identification between the subject and the other, right? So Hamlet's double, you know, strikes in the same way as E.T. Hoffman's Sandman would, or in the same way as Freud's kind of image of himself in the window, or of his kind of on the train, right, introduces this feeling of the uncanny, or this kind of sense of anxiety. So kind of to go back a bit to kind of Freud here, again, for Freud, modernity as a whole is characterized by anxiety, right? Lacan's incredulous. Why do we still have it? How do we put anxiety to analysis, right? But for Freud, civilization's progress and modernity breeds all its discontent, right? The malaise, the neurosis, which is always kind of a socialized anxiety, a collective anxiety, as Freud describes it. So there's anxiety in Freud's account is an unpleasant feeling, arises from necessary repression, which signals this dialectic of identification that Lacan picks on, right? This problem of this doubling, this uncanny, this misrecognition that is that occurs, that faces the subject in a particular moment. Anxiety is a surplus element, an excess that somehow emerges between subject and other, but almost is in the way of the concept, right? It emerges when there is an object that comes to sit in the place of the concept, or the objet a. Anxiety is related to loss, to lack, to castration, separation anxiety, the anxiety of being born, etc. But then Freud comes to this, you know, anxiety precedes repression. It is the driving force of repression. And of course, Freud stops there, right? And Lacan comes to add to this, right? That, you know, that it's not simply related, anxiety is not simply related to loss or to lack. It doesn't only arise from an experience of lack, but Lacan adds to this from a lack of a lack. In a sense, stated in kind of simpler terms, anxiety doesn't simply result from the loss of the other, the mother, the other, etc., but from the disappearance of the lack in the other, to which the subject's desires, in a sense, destined to correspond to. So it arises, according to Lacan, from a lack of a lack, from an experience of a full other, of being engulfed by the other. So rather than an absent mother, one can think of an overbearing mother who won't leave the child alone. And this is a crucial point that Lacan introduces in considering anxiety. The appearance of an element that is meant to be invisible from this kind of specular moment, the specular relationship, the mirror stage, the appearance of an element in the place where it ought to remain invisible, where it ought to remain not there. So there's this kind of game on that Lacan plays on, you know, the non-specular element that is brought into the specular, right, into the image that becomes visible, and it is there where anxiety, in a certain sense, abounds, right? To kind of it presents itself. So in a way to make a long story short, if that's possible, the affect of anxiety arises from encountering an object in the place of objet. There is a lack that is crucial for identification, the unary trait, whatever. And then there's something, a person, a thing, a fetish, a partial object that fills the lack, a double, a sandman, the gaze. There's a lack of a lack. And then there's extreme anxiety. The desire of the other gains this frightening fullness, right? Like Medusa's gaze, it petrifies the subject, potentially has the capacity to shatter them into pieces, right? So this is kind of Lacan's move, or kind of what Lacan introduces in a way, in a certain sense, beyond Freud, or with Freud, moving in a slightly kind of different direction. However, there's an agreement, in a sense, between Freud and Lacan in a certain way, that anxiety abounds, right? It is there when there's a crisis in the symbolic, right? Or again, to kind of restate it, when the inherent instability of the symbolic, the necessary instability of the symbolic is obfuscated, covered up, or when the big other is assumed to really be there in its fullness, right? So, I mean, needless to point out here that this crisis is constitutive of the modern, postmodern condition. We can have a long discussion whether we can really say it's just postmodern or there's something already of it in modernity itself. And, you know, it is engendered in this kind of moment that we're in, this crisis in the symbolic. If there ever was a symbolic that wasn't in crisis, right? This is kind of the open, another open question. So this kind of a so-called crisis in the big other is, in a way, coincidental with the increase in affects, or this, what me and Samo, I guess, are calling this kind of situation of over-affection. Affects are, you know, fundamentally in psychoanalysis are characterized by not being anchored to any single identifiable signifier, right? Anxiety, panic, fatigue. Affects resist being signified, being spoken, turned into speech. They're lost. They're, you know, as Freud would have put it, essentially transformations of the libido, right? I think the way he put it was, you can think about affect and anxiety in particular in relationship to the libido, like you would consider wine in comparison to vinegar, right? There's this kind of transformation of libido. And most importantly, affects demand analysis and working through, right? In particular, the affect of anxiety. I mean, Lacan says somewhere in the seminar that without anxiety, the management of anxiety is precisely what drives the entire analytic setting, the clinical setting, right? The process of analysis. So in this way, one can say that affects are not symptoms, right? But they arise from the attempts of the imaginary to signify a lack in the symbolic, right? To fill it with something, to fill this lack with something. Or maybe in very simple Freudian terms, these affects are egoic defenses, if we take the ego as this kind of imaginary function, that are used to defend against the symptom, right? So it's very interesting here, and this is a point that I guess one goes missing, is that, you know, the ego or the imaginary function will go to unbelievable ends to protect itself from the disrupting, destabilizing effect of anxiety. phobias, paranoias, fetishisms, obsessive compulsions, procrastinations, eating compulsions, even paralysis. These are all put into work to fend off, to hold off the destabilizing effect of anxiety, right? So in a certain sense, this is very much contrary to popular psychology, right? Anxieties work to fend off the symptom. They're not a symptom themselves, right? There's this very intriguing distance between anxiety and symptom, to hold at bay, right? They work to hold at bay the compulsions that may carry the key to unraveling the singularity of every subject's enjoyment, every subject's jouissance. So in a sense, one can think about disaffection here, and this is again, something I would just put out there, is that perhaps this affection in psychoanalysis perhaps describes best the ego, the description of the ego, right? Which, as we know, is not equivalent to the subject, but this kind of inert, mute, deaf, alienating, imaginary function. And in a sense, the ego is always disaffected, a stranger in its own house, right? It builds a garrison that prevents the subject from separating from the other. So the ego has to be disaffected to maintain its imaginary function of unity, right? This is something, perhaps disaffection is kind of, one can think about it at the site of the ego and the site of the imaginary. So, I mean, I think I've gone over time here, but I perhaps want to suggest that maybe disaffection, is quite tricky, quite dangerous to kind of deal with, whether clinically or, simply kind of theoretically, right? In clinical terms, disaffection always leads to, in a certain way, the disavowal of affects lead to these symptomatic bodily, right, kind of states, right? There's their conversion, they get converted into an organization of the body and the soma. And so the question, I mean, beyond the clinic, the question, and this is here, I'll stop here, is, how, in contradistinction to considering affect and the question of anxiety and insisting on putting anxiety to work, to working through anxiety, what would the feeling sick of politics or being disaffected, what does it do for us in our contemporary societies of enjoyment? Is our, is this kind of, although our enjoyments in a certain sense appear to be private, right? They're always tied up to these symbolic orders, to libidinal economies and structures of enjoyment. And these hold sway precisely when we disavow their existence through our imaginary and private enjoyments. So while the retreat into our private worlds, perhaps those that are apathetic and disaffected with larger issues like society and politics, appear to be in a position of transgression against the other and the order that is beyond them or beyond us, right? But can't we consider that this very retreat or illusion of psychical interiority, a privacy to enjoyment, tends to actually do the opposite, to do the work of shoring up the other? And perhaps I would venture to say here that the politics of anxiety may prove to be more productive for emancipatory aims than those of disaffection, because they demand analysis and conceal desires that cannot be spoken or named. In a way, there's a kind of an openness to anxiety that despair lacks in a certain sense. So this characteristic of anxiety, of not being without an object, being in the way of the object or in the way of the concept, is crucial, because it emerges when this kind of negativity or lack that is crucial for the formation of subjectivity goes missing, and some other object comes to sit in this place. And here I would conclude that without this anxiety, without this kind of affect, in fact, what happens is that the subject is barred from the real, stuck in this intermediary play between the imaginary and the symbolic, stuck in the reality of habits, right? Busy with the imaginary cover-ups for the gap in the symbolic. And this is where one would insist this would be the importance, in a certain way, of maintaining a place for the analysis of anxiety as an affect and working through it, right? Okay, I'll start. It's kind of a train crash through kind of thinking about anxiety, kind of psychoanalytically. I suppose I put out a lot of things there, and I'll just turn it over to Samo. So thanks.
Thank you. First of all, thank you also for my part, Ben, for having me in this session, and it's always wonderful to engage in a discussion with you, Nadia, Justin, and the global Lacanian community that is causing me anxiety at this moment in this Zoom session. Nadia already brought the best possible framing of this debate. So I feel very much tempted to simply react to what she was saying, but at the same time, I will try to kind of justify why we picked up this very contemporary, very timely, but also very problematic signifier that is resentment, ressentiment. And I would maybe first still react to some things or pick up some things that Nadia mentioned, and then start from there to move on to resentment. One thing is this idea of structural instability and the link with affect. Of course, there has never been a stable social order or a stable symbolic order, as Nadia said, and I think the difference that I would like to bring into this discussion, for also thinking about this opposition of anxiety and ressentiment, is perhaps unstable symbolic order on the one hand, or unstable order on the one hand, and an order, a symbolic order or a socioeconomic order that's running amok. And this, I think, is something that characterizes capitalism. I mean, particularly in the present, I think this is more or less evident with the increase of systemic resistance that we have been witnessing, also on the affective level with the rise of resentment, but also structurally. I think, the Marxist tradition has been describing this amok run of the global capitalist system through the idea of structural crisis. Without which we cannot think capitalism, and without which we cannot think this orientation of the capitalist economy towards a perpetual increase in profit, with all the fantasies that come along with it. So this would be one opposition that I would like to perhaps discuss into the discussion: unstable symbolic order and an order that's running amok, that is basically aiming at a total dismantling of social links and environmental connectivities. And of course, also dismantling of subjectivity as such, as a condition for continuous extraction of surplus value out of bodies, environment, and social connections. Another thing, and I think this is where the critical value of psychoanalysis really continues to remain extremely big for our contemporary political debates, is when it comes to what Nadia called the management of anxiety, or what Lacan said, that basically in the analytic setting, the analytic work consists in careful dosage of anxiety. So a careful dosage of anxiety is neither over-affection nor is it evidently disaffection, but it's, and here I again want to affirm Nadia's formula, that it's a management of affect, that it's a certain sort of mobilization of a specific affect that is, of course, also extremely problematic and can lead to over-affection for a transformative work, for what Freud called Durcharbeiten, working through. So no Durcharbeiten, no work on a problematic structure that conditions my illness without the careful dosage of anxiety. I guess this is where we can also observe that, or we can risk the thesis that that anxiety bears in it the potential of constructing a social bond that is not aiming at exploitation, so that basically helps to orient the subject in the analytic process or within a social bond towards a transformative work on structure, and also towards establishing bonds with other subjectivities. And you know very well what Freud said in mass psychology, all social characteristics are already established in the bond between two subjects. So that's why Lacan could insist that the analytic setting is a social bond already, which means also that we have to think against these attempts that are still very much present in the analytic community to kind of detach analysis as a process of cure from the analytic discourse, or to kind of privatize, to establish this kind of differentiation between the analytic bond and other social bonds. Psychoanalysis is already a social bond. If we take Lacan's formula seriously, then we have to conclude that as a social bond, the analytic discourse also exists outside the analytic cabinet. So I guess this is also where I would personally look at the connectivities between what psychoanalysis teaches about its own specific social bond and the aims, orientations, and struggles of emancipatory politics, which is also a politics of working through. But to finally come to resentment, of course, we all know that this is not particularly, it's definitely not the name of an affect with which psychoanalysis would operate. We do not find it in Freud. We do not definitely find it in Lacan. It's an affect, it's a name of an affect, or we can also discuss whether it's an affect or an emotion. I would say that it's precisely a name that kind of complicates the relation between affect and emotion, because it kind of describes a subjective state that has a certain longue durée. So it would move more towards what we spontaneously understand as emotion, but at the same time, it has something disruptive of an affect in it. So it's at the same time standing for a certain perpetual disruption of the subject, perpetual disturbance, perpetual unrest in the subject that has the specificities of the disruptive nature that we associate with affects in general. So basically the thesis that I would maybe offer into the discussion, that the relation between anxiety and resentment, as it can be observed today, can be thought of in the following terms: that resentment is a sort of defense against anxiety, or also a certain resistance against anxiety, which is particularly system conform. Why system conform? I mean, in a way, Nadia already, the way she talked about anxiety showed how anxiety can be mobilized precisely through its impossibility to be associated with a very univocal framing for different purposes, where resentment cannot. Resentment integrates the subject in the affective economy that is system conform and is marked very univocally by a hostility towards difference. So it's basically reducing the Nebenmensch, the neighbor, other human beings to small other for sure, but in an imaginary sense of the term, as a threat, as someone who deprives me of my enjoyment, or as someone that threatens my or deprives me of my access to this idea of full unproblematic enjoyment in being, and it functions as a disturbance also in what I perceive as my form of life. This is already something that Nietzsche indicated, and I mean, Nadia was mentioning Kierkegaard as the theoretician of anxiety that kind of anticipates in many ways what Freud and Lacan would be doing. But Kierkegaard was also someone who was already thinking about ressentiment. But Nietzsche would be the 19th century thinker that we necessarily have to reference when talking about ressentiment. Now, Nietzsche constructed a myth, a mythology around ressentiment, because as you know, Nietzsche used the term for describing an affective economy characteristic for weak subjectivity, for the figure of the slave, and the organization of this affective economy of resentment takes for Nietzsche the expression in what he called slave morality. Now, of course, we don't need to lose much time on problematizing the expression slave morality, but leaving this aside, we can recall that Nietzsche uses this term in order to address a specific historical subversion in the moral order, which places weakness and negation in the place of moral virtue. Associating this subversion, where weakness becomes the cornerstone of a universal moral order with the rise of Christianity, Nietzsche thus strives to pinpoint a historical mutation in the field of affects, where an affective economy is introduced that is rooted in a continuum between symbolic violence directed inwards, so self-negation, and a certain aggressivity addressed to the other. And this other being, for Nietzsche, this figure of self-affirming aristocrat, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, Nietzsche does not problematize this opposition between the slave and the aristocrat, or the self-affirming lord, but takes it for a certain transhistorical fact. And this is where I think also critiques of Nietzsche, for instance, by Domenico Losurdo in his book on Nietzsche, but also someone like Max Scheler, are of great value because they both, basically pinpointed where Nietzsche is mystifying ressentiment. They basically place the accent on the same feature. Nietzsche is ultimately a crypto liberal, or a sort of, as Losurdo puts it, a sort of strange fusion of liberalism and aristocratism, or a certain nostalgia towards an old school type, ancien regime type of aristocracy. And the placement on, and this is, I mean, where Nietzsche then mystifies resentment is precisely that he overlooks how resentment connects or stands in continuum, or is symbolically conditioned by the expansion of relations of competition and on all spheres of life, and the imperative, the systemic imperative characteristic for capitalism, for capitalist organization of life, the imperative to renounce life, or to renounce pleasures that would, sort of characterize something like life. And this is where Lacan comes in, particularly his developments in the 16th seminar, where he also basically claims that the moral order that is inaugurated by capitalism is renunciation of pleasures, and links this renunciation with, basically with the transformation of the function of labor in the capitalist modernity, the invention of abstract labor, or as he puts it, that basically labor swallows everything. All the processes that can be described as being vital are channeled through this abstraction that is labor, and for which we can say that is basically the quantified and valorized form of life. Now, here I guess for concluding, I would link to what Nadia was talking about, the feeling of lack in anxiety, which is on the level of resentment, experienced as a sort of the condition of deprivation, the illusion of a primordial loss, which could eventually be regained if the small other that is blocking me from, reaching the last object would be overcome. And the hostility that characterizes resentment is precisely directed or an expression of this kind of idea, passive aggression towards this small other, towards fellow human being, bluntly put. So it's fundamentally an antisocial affect, which grounds an antisocial social bond, to put it somewhat paradoxically, but at the same time, it is an affect that is not only characteristic for capitalist subjectivity, but for the system as such. It's the system itself that treats every subjectivity as an obstacle in reaching this kind of ideal state of perpetual growth of value, or what Marx calls the self-valorization of value, the self-realized automatic subject. And just to conclude, we all know Margaret Thatcher's claim there is no such thing as anxiety, as society, sorry. There's no such thing as anxiety, I wish. There's no such thing as society, which is not an innocent ontological claim, just saying, okay, society is a phantasmatic illusion which does not exist. What is there are individuals and their families and so on and so forth. So it's not a neutral ontological claim. It's basically a claim that is underpinned by a prohibition, by an aggressive prohibition. Society must not exist, or such a thing as society must not come into being. So one could see here precisely this point of targeted aggression towards an obstacle between what neoliberalism conceives as the ideal condition in which the extraction of value can perpetuate indefinitely, and a threat here objectified precisely in the idea of social bond that links rather than unlinks or unties or dismantles life and subjectivity. So yeah, I mean, sorry, this is a bit of a scattered intervention, but here I would say we also encounter a situation where both affective states can be seen, as being conditioned in this process of ongoing dismantling of bonds that would provide some minimal consistency, and in the ideal case, a non-exploitative consistency of the subject and of social relations. So we could again have jump back to what Nadia was addressing under the idea of structural instability and its link to affect. And say basically the function of resentment as an antisocial social affect is precisely to be embedded on the one hand in this increasing amok run of the system, fueling into this amok run, intensifying it. And if we speak in relation to populism today about the increase of resentment, we are basically speaking about not an isolated social phenomenon, but more of a systemic tendency of which populism is merely a poster boy or merely a contemporary phenomenology. Whereas, I mean, the question is whether we should speak here of, as an alternative of the politic of anxiety, like Nadia did. I'm not really, I mean, I'm somehow not comfortable with the expression, because, of course, part of the problem in this relation between anxiety and resentment is that the increase in anxiety is also very much system conform and triggers this reaction where a confrontation with my own real status within the totality of the capitalist mode of production that takes place on the level of anxiety can very easily trigger affective resistance that is resentment. So, I mean, I guess that's how I understood the expression also, the politics of anxiety. So not really a call for more anxiety, but more like a call for management, organization, and working through anxiety, because in any case, these are both wrong affects. These are both affects that are linked with this tendency towards the dissolution of social bonds that are today also at the core of our catastrophic developments on the global scale. Sorry again for this more or less free associative intervention, but yeah, I felt much more seduced by what Nadia was saying than by the imperative to stick to my own notes and text parts. So thanks again for bearing through this.
Well, look, thank you both. Thank you, Nadia and Samo. They're obviously, like, it's been I've been tasked with responding to them. And since it's, Ben said he wanted to keep this to an hour, I think that with the principle of free association and the introduction of variable sessions by Lacan, it seems utterly ridiculous to cut to cut this session short. Of course, Lacan did, but I think we need to protract this. And so I'm going to just spontaneously and unilaterally propose that we extend this till at least 6:30, maybe 8:30, maybe till midnight. But that said, I'm now going to launch into a kind of disquisition of my own, which sadly after both Nadia and Samo, will have to say is just like a pale echo of two absolutely kind of brilliant presentations from which I'm still sort of reeling a bit, which is preferable to either anxiety or resentment, but hopefully my resentment of both of them will kick in again soon, and I'll be able to calm this down. First of all, I think that the context that both Nadia and Samo outlined is exactly the right one. Nadia placed it in the context of the Frederick Jameson, the waning of emotion, where the complex historical feelings that we might have, which are often very complex, ambivalent and overdetermined, have waned really in favor of something called affect, which is a certain unstable, imperceptible, essentially imperceptible phenomenon whose identity and provenance must remain unclear, and hence the slightly disturbing and aspects of anxiety. That's the affective context, whereas the political economy context into which Samo outlined, which is of course capitalism's current direct assault on all social links and environmental continuities, and as actually a principle of extraction. Very, very important. No longer does imperialism build bridges and set up capitals in other countries. It now literally just flat out destroys social bonds, as we can see all over the world, and I guess of which one of the emblems would be the destruction of Iraq, like pure and simple destruction of Iraq. Now, regarding the relationship then between resentment or envy, as we might say, and anxiety, it seems that these two, let's call them affects, because in some cases, in some senses, they're imperceptible. They seem to be antithetical, but they also seem to be composed, or at least articulated, in a kind of form of machinery, which, as Samo pointed out, really one eggs the other on. Or as Nadia also suggested, that maybe no, they can be detached. And I think that the question that if we are discussing one today, it's around the possible rearticulation of the nexus or between anxiety and envy. Are they, as Nadia suggested, possibly can we do something with anxiety in such a way as to call for new sets of signifiers that are directed against disaffection, or is it rather the case, as Samo's been suggesting, that no, the anxiety is leading to a hypertrophy of the imaginary phenomena of paranoia, of ego defenses of one kind or another. And I think for me that's the key split in what they said, or at least the key point that we should discuss. But I also do want to sort of affirm and reiterate that why are these not two emotions or affects among others? Well, one, because first of all, as affects, they have this there's these interesting non-qualities of being essentially imperceptible, although absolutely unmissable, if that's a thing, that they're not without objects, or they're not without a direction towards objects and the assault on those objects, and simultaneously that both of them, one of them tears away the possibility of a staging, which is anxiety, and I'll come back to this briefly, whereas something like envy or ressentiment is constantly looking to a stage itself as well as part of its operations. This at least is the thesis that I'll briefly I'll briefly propose. When we think of when we think of envy in a Lacanian frame, there's obviously a whole series of fabulous antecedents. I think David Hume is strangely enough one of them. The common soldier envies the sergeant rather than the general. It's always proximity that envy latches onto as a function. And of course, there's Nietzsche, as Samo has outlined. I would also think in a strictly psychoanalytic context that the great theorist of envy is Melanie Klein. And then Lacan, picking up on all of these references, then invokes, of all people, Saint Augustine, in the very famous account which Augustine says as a child, looking at his mother breastfeeding a younger sibling and being overwhelmed with of envy. And when Augustine reflects upon this overwhelming feeling of ressentiment and distaste towards his own little brother, I think it is, Augustine says, well, why? I would not be sucking at my mother's tits. That's disgusting. I could not use the milk. That is disgusting. What is it that I was so offended by when I looked at this was I could not bear the sight of someone else enjoying something that I could not and did not want to have. And so the videre, which is the video aspect, and we're all on video now, let's be frank, the videre, the video aspect of envy, which is always linked to a staging and to link to a phenomena of the other stealing enjoyment that you do, and enjoyment from you that you do not want. So it's already quite a paradoxical structure. But let's just say for Lacan, it does mean that the rats in the ruins of the decaffected consumer zones would prefer to attack their neighbours than to attack the causes of their distress, and hence the problematic of anxiety. And I did, when I was thinking about what both Samo and Nadia were saying, did think of one of Lacan's other great images of what anxiety is, which is you go to a fancy dress party, you see someone dressed as a praying mantis, and then anxiety is shit, what did I come as? And so you're not even sure whether whether you've dressed up as prey in fancy dress for the other, and which is of course another great fable for this era of masks. What form of prey did I come as? Will I be eaten by this fancy dress? But once again, the phenomenon of staging, we go back to Hamlet and the Mousetrap, is also very, very crucial here. Now, I think to sort of point to that rather than answer it, and I will conclude now to return to something like the waning of emotion, but also the Thatcherite absolute and directed, deliberate destruction of all social bonds whatsoever. I would want to propose, under the cover of these two scenes of envy and of the familial ressentiment and also the anxiety of the fancy dress party, I'd like to say that one of the things that we do need to speak of is how we are connected, which is, and I'll give the formula for it, is we're using a corporate means of communication now, is that part of the problem of the failure of the symbolic, of language as such, and not just this or that failure of language, but language in its so-called entirety, even though there is no such entirety today, is entirely underwritten and exacerbated by the techniques of the expropriation of communication as such, which we're now experiencing with, I guess, the regnancy of Silicon Valley. And I think this is the final. Yes, Marxists have talked about expropriation of the means of production, and we can think about expropriation of territory. But I think we're in a very, very dangerous era, and one that does bring up the question, the links between ressentiment and anxiety again in this very, very particular way, which is what happens when we no longer own the means of our own communication, that itself is expropriated, deterritorialized, and in fact corporatized, owned by someone other than us. I'll stop there, but thank you all very much.
Okay, it's after 6, but Justin's right. There's no point, calling it too short. You can log off if you want to. So let's at least give some time for further discussion. So if anyone wants to raise their hand in the Zoom way or visually, I'd be happy to take some questions. Or Samo or Nadia could respond to Justin. So.
I feel interpellated by both Justin and Samo, so I just want to kind of a comment. I mean, I guess the tension, or in a certain sense, what's Justin's, I think the formulation on staging is brilliant and very, very important. But I mean, I think Justin and Samo both noted that so the claim is, we need more politics of anxiety. That's not precisely kind of what I'm saying. I think the point would be we cannot disavow the work of anxiety that is political. Like, this is fundamental. I think this is something that, there is something about politics that is anxious, right? That is a place of struggle, right? And disavowing that, not working through that, of course, leads to panic, racism, xenophobia, all these kinds of populism, ressentiment, all these kind of sub branches of ressentiment, right? But I think what's fundamental is when we say the working through of anxiety is that, anxiety, I mean, as Lacan puts it, right? It's a sign of the other's, it's a sign of the other's desire, right? And the other's desire, right? Anxiety is always the anxiety of the other. And this is, of course, the systemic kind of account of anxiety, right? And the point would be is, once subjectivity is able to sit with that, right? To work through that, right? To kind of reach out for a signifier that is missing, right? Then perhaps this kind of management of that anxiety, right, is meant to, in a certain sense, dispel this illusion, right, of the fullness of the other. The other is there, the other desires, this is what the other wants, right? Because buying into that fantasy, right, is fundamental for allowing this kind of extractivist, as you describe it, Samo, this kind of mode of, this political economic mode to kind of continue, right, to kind of almost in a sense vampirically, right, kind of extract value and kind of dismantle subjectivity in that way. So, I mean, I guess that would just be a comment on, so I think, I don't think, we have to anxiously accept that there is anxiety in politics, and we can't assume that affects don't play a fundamental role in people's, the way they kind of navigate themselves in relationship to the other, to collectivity, to community, to all that. I mean, that would be the fundamental, in a certain sense, kind of lesson to psychoanalysis, right? You stage the anxiety in the clinic only for it to lead to somewhere, right? The anxiety is being staged in the clinical setting, right? In this extimate place for the purpose of a working through, perhaps, which might require a dissolution of one's own, their mechanisms of enjoyment, right? That's why in this, I mean, again, Lacan uses anxiety as crucial for the separation between enjoyment and desire. Another fundamental kind of distinction that is, I mean, I think, important to consider in relationship to the intersection of psychoanalysis and politics, right? This is, I mean, I would just say that and stop there.
Harry?
Hi there. Great talks today. Very, very interesting and thought-provoking from all speakers. When considering the current Melbourne freedom protests, how do we understand ressentiment in terms of the small other and the privation of enjoyment of the subject in an unstable symbolic order? And
I guess for context for the international guests, that is a fairly classic anti-lockdown, mask type protest, just to give a brief survey of what's going on. So yeah, how do we understand those sorts of responses to COVID?
So can I give a quick answer, because I just read it. One of my friend Brian Cook's tweeted about this precisely. There's a great sequence of protesters. At one point, there are a lot of these protesters, mainly white, mainly middle-aged, maybe male, on the top of the Westgate Bridge, a very big bridge for those who don't know it, going towards the House of Melbourne. Huge, and so they're all on the top of it, and they all start singing Daryl Braithwaite's song, which you may or may not know, as if you're not really into, called Horses. Anyway, my friend Brian Cook tweeted about this. He said, look, and it goes back to something that Samo said. He said, look, if like Maggie Thatcher, you've been spending 30 years pretending there's no society, desperately, he did it in a tweet so much better and sharper than I'm doing it now, trying to cut off all social bonds, then it's no wonder that you'll get swarms of disaffected particles looking for a master signifier. And if the best they can do is let off a flare and sing Horses, you can see, and this does come back to something Samo was saying about populism as just the poster boy for a much more widespread and stinky, can we say, like late capitalist switching off the social link. Sorry, that was my Brian Cook relayed response to you, Harry.
Thank you.
John Cash?
Yeah, look, as no one's jumping in, I'll raise something that, broadly speaking, relates to what everyone was speaking about. And I guess it picks up on what Justin was just saying. The issue with anxiety, the management of anxiety, has a lot to do with, to put it this way, what comes next. That is to say, what master signifier is turned to. The people on the bridge, there are discourses that they are inhabiting which answer that, provide an answer to that lack, that fill the lack in a particular way. And so I think this is a lot to do with the real politics of what's going on. That is to say, what are the alternatives? How are the alternatives being provided, offered, made available, that contradict that in sufficiently powerful ways that build social bonds that are alternate to that? I'll just leave it at that as a suggestion. Well, just very briefly, a lot of what has been said also does relate to the whole issue of the so-called demise of symbolic efficiency. In a world, and I think in many ways everyone's been talking about that, but in a world in which the demise of symbolic efficiency is accelerated, as it were, then the possibility for these moments of anxiety, which are both affective but also take emotional particularity as they find master signifiers of one kind or another and stabilize for the moment in terms of organizing groups, organizing forms of social bonds, which can take any number of particular forms, but which we know are tending towards constructions of the world in terms of friend-enemy modes of being, thinking, feeling, and relating. I'll just throw that out there. And
if I may, just one remark, because it's also going in this direction that kind of somehow troubles me also in the psychoanalytic discussions, the question of the crisis of symbolic efficiency, and this idea that that there used to be some sort of stability of the symbolic order, anchored in the name of the Father as this function of symbolic law that regulates and mediates and so on. It's this is where also in a way the critique of Nietzsche, this holy saint of a certain critical theory, comes very convincing to me, and that's also why I was saying that around resentment Nietzsche constructs a mythology, because well, in a way, he doesn't question the figure of the master or of the aristocrat that he is setting up as this self-affirmative, this constitutive or self-constituting strong subjectivity, and there precisely intersects with the liberal fantasy of Homo economicus as well, this kind of self-constitutive subject of economic and social relations that is not dependent on relationality, on the bond to others, and if so, only because such subject is always already embedded in this kind of mutual seduction of others in exchange and kind of strive for profit for all. So basically, what Nietzsche remains blind for is that modernity is grounded on a different type of excessive mastery, or of an excessive master figure, which is what I was trying to kind of address with this idea of an extractivist master, which makes me also think of the way Marx formulates this idea of an extractivist master when he talks about capital sucking living labor or extracting value, which basically what the extraction of living labor is out of the working bodies, and we can expand to environments, to all forms of life, and so on and so forth. So the vampire type of behavior that Nadia was also mentioning. So there is absolutely no trace of this very modern figure of the master in Nietzsche. So maybe sounds like a personal issue that I'm overblowing here, but I think Nietzsche did much more damage for understanding the systemic function of resentment than explaining it. Sorry.
Knox. He's gesticulating wildly.
Hi, yeah, I want to just second what you said, Samo, vociferously. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. Thank you for that. Very good. Comments all around. Also, fortuitously, the same notebook that I was taking notes from the session in also has my notes on Max Shaler's Ressentiment, which I read for the first time a few weeks ago. And there's this passage I highlighted, I wrote down, that speaks to what you're saying, Samo, and I just wanted to share it, where he says, the elimination of revelation from the constitutive forms of cognition, so that obviously has a Christian connotation, but you can, in place of revelation, put in paternal signifier, that exists independently of sensory experience and reason, is an achievement of ressentiment, which wants to make, quote, general human cognizability the criterion of truth and existence. And so I think that's, and that comes after a discussion of Marx, and he's already criticized Nietzsche a lot. And what he's saying is this whole general human cognizability as criterion of truth and existence is what you were saying about abstract value, right? That's just whatever can be rendered abstract or generic in that way. And it's this utter loss of any constitutive form of cognition that would be independent of a sensory experience or reason in this kind of debased sense that he's talking about. So I just think that you mentioned him along with Lisordo, that it's an absolutely important intertext for understanding what's wrong with the Nietzschean critique of ressentiment. And that Shaler himself has his own ambivalent relationship to psychoanalysis and what's going on in that moment. But at least insofar as it relates to these issues of loss of the paternal signifier, loss of the name of the father, symbolic crisis, then I do think, and obviously, again, mediated through a Christian context for Shaler, I think it's really important. So it's just kind of an endorsement of your view, and I'll desist right there.
May I very briefly add a comment to that? Because I mean, yeah, Shaler was, of course, reactionary in the sense that he wanted to save Christianity from Nietzsche's criticism, but nevertheless, as every good conservative or every good reactionary, he made some points that we need to take into consideration, and that is that ressentiment is, well, first of all, a systemic affect linked to liberalism. Sorry for repeating myself, and that this affect marks the discontinuity between pre-modernity and modernity. Christianity, wonderful to think, for love and anxiety, the New Old Testament, the excess of the law and anxiety, the religion of love with the New Testament, and also kind of, providing us a theory of the instability of the symbolic order, whereas ressentiment is leading us to the system of organized aggressivity. And we can't really say for Christianity, no matter how atheist we want to be, that it's a system of organized aggressivity. Another quote that I really like from Schiller that points in the direction of psychoanalysis is that, quote, "The modern ascetics formed an ideal whose ethical sense is the exact opposite of the old one, the ideal of minimum of enjoyment face of the maximum amount of pleasurable and useful things," unquote. So basically, capitalism, it's a useless mode of production, basically what he's saying. That it's this overproduction of possible sources of pleasure, but at the same time, prohibiting to actually mobilize everything that is being produced for kind of improving our mode of existence or improving our form of life as social beings. It's everything that is being produced as useless, as cut off from usefulness. So in a way, I mean, he's addressing precisely the issue that Lacan also addresses in Seminar 16 when he says, modern morality is characterized by the imperative to renounce pleasures, or as he puts it, to renounce enjoyment, which he understands as an imperative to renounce life, being prohibited to live. That's basically what characterizes capitalism. It prohibits us to live. So,
Elias?
Thanks, and thanks so much, all three. I got an enormous amount out of that. The sort of polite way of saying it. It was hugely compelling. Thank you. So my question may be a bit unformed and stupid, partly because of my ignorance of the Kantian discourse, etc., and partly because I've been madly writing a lecture on Byron today, and that does terrible things to the brain. I wanted to ask Nadia. I was struck by all three, but Nadia, I was particularly struck by your idea about the lack of a lack as driving a peculiar form of anxiety. And my interest in that is partly in the way it sort of forefronts or highlights ideas of surplus and superfluity. What struck me when Justin was talking was sort of hostility towards forms of superfluity that aren't yours, and that related to Samo's talk in forms of extractivism. And what struck me was how often anxiety and disaffection are sort of produced by that weird relationship between, on the one hand, worrying that you are superfluous, on the or sort of in surplus, and that also others are gifted with surplus that isn't yours and you can't monopolize. I just wondered if hopefully that makes some kind of sense. And you know, Nadia, if you have anything on that, I'd be really grateful. And if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for the comment. So you're suggesting that so that it makes this Lacan's idea of a lack as kind of being, you know, what faces the subject, and hence kind of as the, if you want, the kind of the springboard of anxiety, like where anxiety somehow kind of emerges in this kind of strong sense, takes over. Whether that makes, or whether that renders the subject superfluous or feeling as though they are, I suppose maybe the sense would be more this kind of, there's a suffocating, right? There's an unbearable, that's why, so anxiety is almost, you know, even Freud and, you know, Lacan as well, the feeling, you know, of panic attacks, the lump in your throat, this kind of the inability to breathe, right? These kinds of what you would associate with the affect, I mean, are almost, you know, this bodily kind of somatic kind of experience of it or whatever is more a sense of, you know, being suffocated by the experience of being, of existence, right? This is kind of by the enjoyment of the other, because otherwise Lacan would just be, if we fold Lacan into Kierkegaard's existential schema, that doesn't work, right? But I mean, so there's this, in a sense, the subject feels almost like they're being annihilated, right? They're being, you know, this is why the example of Medusa, you know, the gaze of Medusa, right? It just kind of shatter, you turn into stone and you shatter, you become these fragments, right? This kind of the destitution of the subject, right? Of course, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, what would be interesting here is that, you know, and I think, you know, Samo introduces this distinction a while back in his work, this difference between what he calls kind of a constituting alienation of the subject and a constituted one. And I suppose here the mirror side of that would be, I mean, I think this is also a Millerian point, right? This a constitutive anxiety and a constituted anxiety, right? There needs to be the insistence, if we want to read psychoanalysis for the purposes of an emancipatory politics, there needs to be an insistence on, in a certain way, making that distinction. Like there is surely a fundamental anxiety that is, how do you say, kind of, one cannot tear away from the very condition of subjective being subject, right? But however, that cannot be conflated with the anxiety that is kind of fed, right? Was kind of fed and kind of systemically kind of, in a certain sense, harvested and harbored and so on and so forth, right? So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question. I would think about it as kind of like rather the kind of the what is facing the subject is the possibility of their own dissolution, which kind of wants you to grasp, you know, pushes, why grasp, why reach out for a signifier to hold on to, why make a signifier, why basically kind of just create it in a certain way and name something, name a master signifier to move out of this condition. I mean, this is why anxiety, you know, this is why it pushes the discourse of analysis, the analytic discourse. I don't know if that makes sense or kind of corresponds to what you're, what you're thinking about here. Yeah.
Okay, Sean.
So just unmuting myself. Again, like everybody else, I'm just blown away by how extraordinary those talks are. There was one just, it's such a banal statement in a way that you made, Nadia, but it reverberates so powerfully, which is that the objet petit is not a signifier. And in relation to, in particular, I guess what Justin was saying about the corporatization of communication, and I think we could probably add that, you know, language is superseded by code anyway at that juncture, so something in addition is happening there. Also in relation to John's mention of symbolic efficacy, and Samo's extractivism and how exactly that works in the 21st century. The efficient communication was actually invented in 1948. It's Shannon and Weaver, it's the commencement of cybernetics, the whole notion that there would be an efficient means of communication.
And it's premised on the idea that significance is insignificant to an engineer. So we have senders, we have messages, we have receivers, we have noise, which may be a saving grace, but we've got a system in which significance doesn't signify. And that exclusion becomes really imperial. I would say, to the extent that is the hegemonic ideology of the 21st century. In capital, of course. I'm hegemonic not in the sense that everyone believes it, but that everybody acts on it all the time. So I'm rather intrigued by the possibility that the new communicative order doesn't actually wish to address significance. So it's no longer efficient in a symbolic sense, it's efficient in an utterly different way, an inhuman way. Secondly, that it really cannot deal with the objet petit, which merely exists as noise for that system. It's an externality that has to be repressed at all costs in order for the communicative system to operate. And the reason why all that works is because the mode of extraction is now so concentrated on extraction from human affect, affective computing, affective capital, all of which operates on symptoms, namely on behaviors, not on actual emotions at all. So what Stiegler calls, I think Stiegler calls it the proletarianization of the unconscious, seems to me a really, really powerful way of understanding that we no longer, just as we have a completely distributed machine, dispersed machine, which is our preeminent object, we now have a preeminently distributed post-subject. And is that how extraction operates, and is that what is powering the specificity of the anti-social social bonds that Samo is speaking of?
Any respondents? Justin, Samo, Nadia?
Can I answer for Samo? Sorry.
A distributed answer. Yeah.
No, I just feel you've been so generous to what I said. And I mean, I think now it's all sinking in what you said. So I actually want to kind of, no, but I mean, I think what Samo pointed to this kind of, I think this fundamental, you know, this, and this, the critique of Nietzsche, right? This, you know, that Samo is kind of formulating, which is crucial, right? Because it's Nietzsche's, you know, is the backdrop for so much that comes, right? For Foucault, for a particular, I mean, for this kind of idea of the destitution of the subject, right? And I think Samo's, you know, subject is just kind of the result of these anonymous forces, right? That are unfolding, right? And I think Samo's point, which is crucial, which I think you introduced this before, this idea that the subject, you know, there's a laboring subject. There's this labor of the unconscious that is at work, right? That is contra to this destituted subject that is being taken for granted as being the subject of ressentiment, or the subject that has ressentiment, or so on and so forth. So I don't know if that somehow links to, you know, what you were just asking, but in a certain sense, I think the more interesting part is insisting, I suppose, in what I hear Samo saying, insisting on this laboring subject versus kind of just relinquishing the you know, the stage is all there set for this extractivist big subject, right? The capital that is just, you know, capital that is just kind of extracting a surplus value and devaluing, in a certain sense, devaluing human life, if you want to kind of put it simplistically like that. But I think this would be an important, I mean, this would correspond in a certain way to the point raised about extractivism, is rather to insist on the laboring subject, or the labor of the unconscious, versus the destitution of subjectivity. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry, Samo, if I'm putting words into your, but.
No, you're putting the right words. No, of course. I mean, I think the interesting part about, for me at least, in psychoanalysis is that it's also in a way reproletarianizing the unconscious, with already Freud's accent on labor or on Arbeit, on work, productive work, which, well, of course, it's also embedded in his own attempt to provide some sort of energetic foundations for the theory of the unconscious. The entire attempt to kind of see in Helmholtz the epistemological or positive scientific foundations for psychoanalysis and so on and so forth. But speaking about reproletarization, I'm using this formula because I think, and this has been also part of this ongoing discussions on this issue of resentment, is that this is basically an affect that is reformulating the question of lumpenproletarization. Also going back to Marx and to Marx's thesis that the lumpenproletariat is, on the one hand, the bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. I think this is even an exactly reproduced quote from Marx. So that basically the lumpenproletariat is bribed financially, but also resentment can be seen as this sort of affective bribe, as a form of allowed enjoyment that is system conformed, that integrates subjectivity in these destructive tendencies of the global capitalist system and makes it work along with it on an affective level. Yeah, I guess if this entire outburst of populism has been good for something, it's been good for confronting us with the systemic tendencies of globalized lumpenproletarization, where we will be embedded in this imaginary relation of hostility towards our social co-human, also through this imaginary fixation, our actual status within the system, that we are the ones that are always already also being dismantled.
Justin, did you want to add anything? I think we might take that as our final question, but okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. We've gone 35 minutes over, which is good value. Thanks, everyone, for being here and sticking around. We lost a few along the way, but there's still nearly 50 people here. So, right. Thanks. Let's call it a night and have a good day in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, see you, Nadia. See you, Samo. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you.
Thanks a lot for
Bye.